I have been a palliative and in-home care nurse for over a decade. It's a profession that demands a combination of technical skill, patience, and, above all, a deep empathy for human fragility. Over the years, I've seen a bit of everything: families united by grief, emotional goodbyes, and the serene acceptance of the end of life. But nothing in my entire career prepared me for the calculated cruelty and veiled neglect I witnessed at the Almeida family home. I was hired for a task I knew well: to care for an elderly man with dementia, a kind and noble-hearted gentleman named Arthur. However, as the weeks went by, I realized my job went far beyond administering medication and ensuring his comfort. Without ever planning to, I ended up becoming his only line of defense against the very person who should have been protecting him the most, his own son. The son, a man named Ricardo, saw his father not as a person deserving of dignity and love in his final years, but as an inconvenient burden, an obstacle between him and a substantial inheritance. He tried everything to isolate his father from the world, attempted to fire me to replace me with someone more compliant, and did everything possible to silence anyone who dared to get in his way. What he didn't expect, in his arrogance, is that I am meticulous. And I documented every act of neglect, every flimsy excuse, every single penny siphoned away. With the help of unexpected allies, I waged a quiet but relentless battle to ensure that justice, not greed, would have the final word. When I began working for Mr. Arthur, his dementia was already in a moderate stage. The disease manifested in waves. There were days of profound confusion, where he would look at me with vacant eyes, not knowing where he was or who I was. But, between these fogs, there were also moments of crystalline lucidity, almost painful in their beauty. In those instances, the brilliant, witty, and incredibly funny man he once was would re-emerge. He would tell me detailed stories of his youth, of the day he met his late wife, Helena, and, above all, of the overwhelming pride he felt for his only son, Ricardo. Ricardo, to the world, was the personification of success. A soft-spoken businessman with impeccable clothes and a posture that exuded confidence. At first, I admit, he fooled me. He seemed like a dedicated son, genuinely concerned with ensuring his father received the best possible care in his final years. He hired me, offered a fair salary, and in the first few weeks, he would call punctually to ask how his father was doing. But, like a cheap coat of varnish, the facade began to crack, revealing the rotten wood beneath. His visits were a short-lived performance. They were quick and visibly staged. He would arrive, give his father a hug, take a carefully angled selfie of them smiling, and minutes later, the photo would be on his social media with sentimental captions like, "Taking care of the one who always took care of us is a privilege," or, "Time with family is priceless." 5 minutes later, he would already be on his feet, claiming an urgent business meeting had just come up. The first concrete red flag was raised when I began to organize Mr. Arthur's household finances. It was at Ricardo's own request. He handed me a pile of bills and his father's bank details, claiming it would be easier for me to manage the day-to-day payments. That's when I noticed the pattern: large and regular sums of money from my patient's generous pension were being transferred directly into Ricardo's personal account. When I questioned him, as delicately as possible, he was evasive and a bit condescending. "Those are household expenses, Miguel. Garden maintenance, taxes, repairs, things you don't need to worry about." But the numbers didn't add up. They were far greater than the living costs for an elderly retiree in that house. The situation reached a critical point when, on a day of rare and prolonged lucidity, Mr. Arthur called me over, his eyes welling up with a palpable anguish. He confessed that Ricardo had been relentlessly pressuring him to sell the house. "He says it's to pay for a luxury nursing home, a 5-star place, Miguel," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But this house, this is where Helena and I built our life, where we raised him. Every corner holds a memory. I don't want to leave. I want to die here." The look of panic and pleading in his eyes sealed my commitment. I could no longer be just an observer. I decided I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. On Ricardo's next visit, I prepared myself and confronted him. With all the calm and professionalism I could muster, I presented the spreadsheets I had compiled, detailing the money transfers and the actual household costs. Then, I mentioned the conversation I had with his father about selling the property. The mask of the dedicated son didn't just fall, it shattered. His eyes transformed, the forced sympathy replaced by a cutting coldness. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed, his voice low but laden with an unmistakable threat. "You are an employee. A staff member. Your job is to change diapers and administer medication, not to meddle like an auditor in my family's finances." I held my ground. I argued that my contract and my professional ethics required me to ensure Mr. Arthur's complete well-being, and that undeniably included his emotional health, his peace of mind, and his financial security. That was the last straw for him. "You're fired," he declared, his face red with rage. "Pack your things and get out of my house immediately. I'll find someone who understands their limits and knows their place." I knew, in that moment, that if I walked through that door, Mr. Arthur would be left completely unprotected, at the mercy of his son's greed. I looked Ricardo straight in the eye. "I'm not going anywhere," I replied. "I will only leave with a court order, or if your father, in one of his clear moments, personally asks me to go." Ricardo's reaction was one of pure fury. He accused me of poisoning his senile father's mind, of manipulating a vulnerable man to try and benefit myself somehow. He grabbed his phone, gesturing as if to call the police, accusing me of trespassing and refusing to leave. At that instant, the line was crossed. I was no longer just the nurse. I was the obstacle. And I knew I was entering a dangerous and lonely war. In the end, Ricardo didn't call the police. He was too smart for that, knowing a scandal could attract attention he didn't want. Instead, he opted for a more insidious strategy, a scorched earth campaign to discredit me and isolate his father. He called the nursing agency that had recommended me, weaving a web of lies about how I was negligent, insubordinate, and possibly dishonest. He began to intercept calls to the house, telling old friends and neighbors that his father needed absolute rest and couldn't have visitors. The house, already quiet, became a veritable prison. I continued my work, but now with a new purpose. I began to document every minute detail with obsessive precision, the cheap, low-quality food Ricardo brought to save money, the important medical appointments he cancelled at the last minute, the full days when he didn't make a single call to check on his father. My nursing journal became a dossier. Desperate for help, I remembered Mr. Arthur's stories about his younger sister, Clara, a retired teacher with whom he hadn't spoken in almost 5 years. "Ricardo drove us apart," he told me once, with a sigh of regret. "He said she was only after my money." It took days, but after a long search on social media and phone directories, I found Clara's contact information. I called, not knowing what to expect, prepared to be met with suspicion. When I explained who I was and the situation her brother was in, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy, resigned sigh. "I knew it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew Ricardo was capable of this. He was always jealous of his own father, of his success, of his kindness." Clara told me her side of the story. Ricardo had poisoned her against their father with a series of lies, accusing her of being an opportunist, until the relationship between the siblings fractured completely. In that moment, I knew I was no longer alone. Our first ally was on board. Our second ally emerged in a completely unexpected way. Ricardo, in his arrogance and to advance his plan, requested an official evaluation from social services. His goal was clear: to obtain a report declaring his father incapable of living alone, which would give him the perfect argument for selling the house and admitting him to a cheap nursing home. But the social worker assigned to the case, a woman named Helena, was experienced and incredibly perceptive. She didn't fall for Ricardo's dedicated son act. She spoke at length with me, observed my interaction with Mr. Arthur, and then spent almost an hour alone with him. At the end of the visit, as Ricardo escorted her to the door, she discreetly handed me her business card. "Your patient seems to be in excellent hands with you," she said in a low voice, with a meaningful look. But his son, something isn't right. Anything you think is relevant, please, keep me informed. And so, our unlikely alliance was forged. The three of us, me, the nurse, with the day-to-day evidence, Clara, the aunt, with the family context and genuine love for her brother, and Helena, the social worker, with the knowledge of the system and the authority to make a difference. The battle heated up quickly. Ricardo, feeling he was losing control, filed a formal petition in court to be appointed his father's sole legal guardian. This would give him absolute power over Mr. Arthur's life and assets. In his petition, he attacked us violently, accusing me of elder abuse and manipulation, and Aunt Clara of being an opportunist who had reappeared only with an eye on the inheritance. It was a low blow, calculated to intimidate us and drain us financially with legal costs. We fought back. With the guidance of a lawyer Clara hired, we filed our own petition, requesting that she be appointed guardian. Our case was robust, built on the evidence I had meticulously collected, the bank statements showing the siphoning of money, the photos I took of the empty pantry and refrigerator, my detailed journal that contrasted my constant care with Ricardo's flagrant neglect. Helena's official testimony, as a social services professional, was a key piece. She described Ricardo to the court as a controlling, evasive man, primarily focused on financial matters, demonstrating little to no genuine interest in the emotional and physical well-being of his father. The day of the hearing arrived, charged with an almost palpable tension. Ricardo showed up with a high-profile lawyer, dressed in an expensive suit, exuding an aura of unshakable confidence. He seemed calm, almost bored. In his opening statement, he painted a moving picture of a loving, overwhelmed son, fighting bravely against a greedy nurse and a distant, opportunistic aunt. He was good, very good at acting. But his arrogance was his undoing. When our lawyer began to cross-examine him, presenting the bank statements one by one, he started to lose his composure. "That's a reimbursement for expenses," he shouted at one point. "I've paid for things for him my whole life, this is my compensation." The judge, a woman with a stern gaze, warned him about his tone. When the lawyer read excerpts from my journal, detailing the long, lonely hours Mr. Arthur waited for a visit or a simple call from his son, Ricardo laughed with disdain. "I have a multinational company to run. I can't be a babysitter 24/7. The sentence hung in the silent courtroom, laden with a cold selfishness that did not go unnoticed. The final blow, however, came from Mr. Arthur himself. By one of those inexplicable miracles, on that specific day, he was having one of his best and most lucid days. Noticing this, the judge wisely called for a recess and requested a private conversation with him in her chambers, accompanied only by a court officer. No one knows exactly what was said in that conversation, but when the judge returned to the courtroom, her face was impassive, her decision already formed in her eyes. Her ruling was crushing and final. She not only vehemently denied Ricardo's guardianship petition but granted permanent and unrestricted legal guardianship to Aunt Clara. And she went further. Based on the irrefutable evidence of financial abuse we presented, she ordered a full criminal investigation into Ricardo's finances. "It is evident to this court," the judge declared loudly, "that Mr. Arthur's physical and emotional well-being has not been his son's priority. On the contrary, everything indicates that his vulnerable condition has been systematically exploited for personal gain." Ricardo was speechless, his face pale with shock. His mask of success and control shattered right there, publicly. The subsequent investigation led him to bankruptcy, forcing him to repay every cent he had diverted, with interest and penalties. He lost everything. Today, Mr. Arthur lives at Aunt Clara's country house, a quiet place surrounded by nature. I am no longer his official nurse, as Clara now coordinates his care. But I visit him every week, not as a professional, but as a friend. Sometimes, he recognizes me, and his eyes light up. "Miguel," he says with a faint smile. "You're a good boy." On other days, he is distant, but I know he is safe, cared for, and, above all, loved. Ricardo disappeared off the map. They say he moved to another country. The house, The grand prize of his greed, was placed in a trust to ensure Mr. Arthur's healthcare costs are covered until the end of his days. Whatever is left, in the most beautiful of ironies, will be donated entirely to a charity that researches Alzheimer's disease. This battle marked me, but it also taught me that true care sometimes requires us to go further. It requires us to fight. Seeing Mr. Arthur, even on his confusing days, sitting on the porch, smiling at the sun, I know that every sleepless night, every moment of stress, every second of that war, was worth it.